Right. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, David. I've been looking forward to meeting you virtually and talking with you.
Me too. Yeah. And it feels kind of weird in a good way because I've been following you pretty closely on Twitter for, I think, a little over a year now. And I feel like we've been sort of intellectually high-fiving on Twitter
Yeah,
a lot.
definitely.
So, and the more that I've learned, not just about your work, but about you and your kind of backstory, kind of the more of a intellectual kinship. I feel partly because I think we're around the same age, same
Yeah,
generation, and so on.
definitely.
So I'm excited to talk, and it's an accident that we are talking the morning after the debate. Did you watch the debate last night?
I never watched the debate, but it came crashing into my world because people were so panicked or scandalized that I was being bombarded with stuff. So then I did end up seeing all the sort of low lights that came flying my direction.
Okay, yeah. Well, I guess that makes me more of a political junkie than you. I had bingo cards. I had people over. We cooked.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
so it
That's a
was,
nice way to do it. There's a human side to it.
yeah, yeah. But I mentioned this at the start of our conversation because I think after last night, more people are paying attention and more people are feeling panicked and uh, in a state of distress, maybe low level distress. And your book is called Lost in Ideology, and I see it as trying to help people make sense of the state of disorientation and anxiety and kind of low level panic. I think that we all feel um, wherever we are on the political spectrum. Um, and so I think probably our conversation will circle back toward the end around how your ideas in this book can help us make sense of what is happening right now to kind of properly locate ourselves in cultural and political and historical space, because that's what I felt reading your book. I felt it was like
Yeah.
the experience I'm sure everybody, all listeners, have had of being in a big uh, noisy crowded shopping mall, and you're like, where am I? How do I get to, like, you know the sharper image or something?
Hmm.
And you find that map, and the map says you are here, that big red arrow, and the feeling of, oh, now I know where I am. That's how I felt reading your book.
Great.
And
Glad to
I
hear
would
that.
encourage, yeah, and what's one
Thanks
reason I
for
would
that.
encourage people
Hmm.
to read it and read it carefully. I told Jason before this conversation that I thought his book was unusually important. And so I hope to convey to listeners why that is, I think, the case through our conversation as we go. So I'll just start out by saying congrats on the book. It sounds like it's getting really well received, great reviews.
Thank
And
you. Yeah.
I appreciate that it's one review said that it's very much a student's book, um, because there's a tremendous amount of erudition in this book, but I think you wear it very lightly. Uh, it's not it's you can feel it, but it's not sort of jargony. And
Mm.
I think it's probably more accessible for students and for the non-specialists. So I imagine that
Mhm.
was highly intentional on your part.
Yeah, I consider myself a humanist, and I think that an American philosophy, even like I'm very influenced by phenomenology, hermeneutics, which I know are big for you as well, David. But I think that an American vernacular has to be found for philosophy, and that style is not philosophically innocent. And so I always try to find a language that is close to the content of my commitments, which is to be able to enter into dialogue with ordinary people. Of course, there's a long tradition of that going back to someone like Socrates, but yeah, so I'm glad that came through in some way because I'm always trying to not have a philosophy that is completely sort of encircled by jargon or by specialization.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of uh, you know speaking of speaking directly to people,
Hmm.
uh, because my entree to your work was through social media, through Twitter, I wanted to start there because I also noticed that you are making creative use of TikTok in conveying philosophy. So, how did you get into using TikTok, and how is that going? What purposes are you do you use it for?
Yeah, not all that well. I mean, it's interesting. I just sort of experiment and bash around, but TikTok is very strange if you're used to formats like Twitter or YouTube, because which are the ones that I primarily use. Back in the day, I was on Instagram and Facebook. I abandoned those. But TikTok has this way of supercharging any post you put up where it shows it to a lot of people, but it seems like it's a shallow engagement. So you'll get like, 2,000 views on a video, but you don't know really who's looking at it or why they're looking at it. Whereas I think that there's a bit of a, pull the slots on Twitter and you don't know who will see it, but it tends to have a bias in favor of you having a built following. So I think there's a kind of exhilaration to TikTok that you immediately get the success of sort of the shallowness of likes and views. But I'm still figuring that one out. I do think that, as part of this humanism, in addition to finding sort of a ordinary language and beginning from the doc says, as Socrates would say, from the opinion, I also think that we have to find where the public square is and work through it, particularly if the interest is political philosophy, which is my interest. And so I think that intellectuals have too much of a sort of puritanical view. I mean, I get the Luddite position. I share to some degree. I just think we also have to see what's positive there. And TikTok, I'm still figuring out what the positive is. But yeah, I've always
It's
thought
an
that
experiment in living,
it is
right?
very much so. And all the bad monsters are there and all the things that people think. But my students don't, they're on TikTok or other places. Their Twitter has become, or X, I suppose I should say, has become older um sort of cohort of people that are there. It's interesting, it's in some decay, but I also believe in sort of following reality and seeing what's happening around me, if that makes sense. So that's why I'm on there. I'm not on there with any sense of like savvy or having unlocked it or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing I appreciate, and I see it come through in your written work too, is this willingness to engage with the detritus and ephemera of pop culture, as it were. When you're talking about libertarianism, you dive into the novels of Ayn Rand. When you're talking about sort of the nostalgia for a simpler, pastoral, time. You talk about country music.
Hmm.
You talk about Joni Mitchell songs. When you talk about progressive counterculture, you quoted Arcade Fire lyrics in a talk that you recently gave about your sort of philosophical origin story. And I really appreciate that because one of my entrees into philosophy was I took a course in college called Nihilism and Popular Culture.
Hmm.
And we read Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor and watched Coen Brothers movies and episodes of Seinfeld and The Simpsons. And it was such a powerful experience for me because it took something I was familiar with, popular culture, and then it helped me see a deeper level of it,
Yeah.
the ideas that were encoded there and the history of those ideas. And that's been my kind of guiding thread going forward. And so it's another reason that I really connected with your work is you're always sort of working at these two levels of how can we make sense of the culture of the present in terms of this deeper backstory.
Yeah, if I
Um,
can say something there, I mean,
yeah,
the humanist tradition, going back to people like Thomas More, Erasmus, but also especially, one of the great admirers of Thomas More, Shakespeare, um, the high and the low are in an interesting sort of dialogue with each other. And I've always tried to keep the high low together. Like one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. is this one with Falstaff where you get the high and low in London, right? And you get both registers. And I think the reasons for retaining both, and I try to retain both the high and the low, even though what you inevitably end up doing is upsetting people who have more popular tastes because you sound too pedantic or too elite, and you upset elite tastes because why are you letting in these kind of low, vulgar tastes? But my view is that, and this does come out of to have high references here for a moment. Heidegger, Gadamer, Charles Taylor, and the hermeneutic tradition is that philosophy is primarily traditions of meaning. And so they're much larger than just the sharpening up of concepts or high theory. That high theory participates in larger worlds of meaning, as Heidegger might say, or disclosures of meaning. And so part of the disclosure of the meanings of philosophy in that sense is much more kindred to me to poetics or literature. It doesn't mean that there isn't a role for logical, conceptual analysis, philosophy, and so on. But I think that there's a very strong bias, a kind of Kantian bias in some schools of thought, and a kind of analytic bias in other schools of thought toward thinking that philosophy is this very sophisticated, technical practice of really putting the clamps on ideas and concepts. And although I think that's true, there's a moment of that in philosophy. I actually have this view that comes out of hermeneutics that philosophy comes out of a kind of larger flow, ideological, spiritual, epical flow that has to do with the meanings that are created, engendered, interpreted in philosophy and reflected upon. And then you can reflect on the streams of meanings in ways that sharpen up the concepts. So to me, philosophy is part of a bigger world of meaning. And that's why I don't think we could exclude the low even if we wanted to. I mean, you can try to kind of define a very high philosophical vocabulary like Kant, but the low, if you like, the popular asserts itself in there. You read someone like Nietzsche say, well, it's very obvious that Kant was just the product of pietist Lutheranism. And, so like the low is somehow there lingering in the background of the high
Unconsciously.
unconsciously as part of the background meanings. So part of the reason I do that is also because of these philosophical commitments I have.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you raised there the issue of the psychology of philosophers, uh, that, yeah, Nietzsche is so well attuned to. And this touches on a deeper issue I want to come back to when we get into your book, which is, once we take the interpretive turn or the hermeneutic turn, how do we guard against slipping into a kind of subjectivism
Yeah.
or relativism? I know you have, developed arguments in the text about that. So that's something we
Hmm.
can come back to. But speaking of psychology and biography, I did want to hear and give you a chance to share with listeners about a bit of
Yeah.
your own coming to these issues. I'll put in the show notes, a link to the talk you gave recently at Loyola University, which was great about your own sort of intellectual trajectory. So yeah, how did you come into philosophy?
Well, to connect up with things we're talking about right now, because there are different ways to tell the story, but one way to tell the story that would connect up to things we're talking about right now is an American boy, an American teenager growing up in the 80s and 90s, as you and I did, if you had it all in a philosophical mindset or intuition or sensibility, what you would have encountered in high school largely, the place where philosophical questions would have been asked was literature and novels, poetry. So a lot of people who have that kind of intuition or sensibility go deep into novels and literature. And in fact, in American life, which does have a philosophical tradition, but is maybe not as rich as it ought to be or could have been, a lot of that talent goes into literary creation. And in the 80s and 90s, I think philosophy appeared as a problem of meaning largely. So you could say that it was very existential, right? As a teenager, as a boy, it's like there was the problem of meaning, a familiar one. You said, I quote Arcade Fire, growing up in the suburbs or the quasi suburbs where everything seems to repeat itself, where a time of any kind of heroism is over, where time of any contact with anything sort of sublime or enchanted seems to be over. And as long as I can remember, I had that problem. I don't think I had it as a boy, but as soon as I started to become kind of conscious of the world around me, I was aware of this problem, what you could call the problem of meaning. Now, I was very lucky because I went to Vassar College and early on encountered existentialism in the phenomenological tradition through an incredibly talented teacher. Her name was Giovanna Boradori. She's still there. She was a phenomenologist, a very sort of staunch but not dogmatically or stupid sort of atheist Heideggerian. And immediately what I saw there was philosophy in the existential tradition is about immediate problems, is about problems of meaning, is about problems of what is my life about? What is the story of my life? What is the relevance of our story as a society, as our community? And, even today, as a professor, I'll have students come up to me and they will have been kind of immersed in Cartesianism or problems of Hume and empiricism, and they'll tell me, "Oh, I've got this problem. How do I even know the world exists out there?" And I said, "You got into my office, didn't you? I mean, something has gone badly wrong with the story that, you have to doubt all your senses because you got here. You're already being in the world." Is what existentialists would say. If you had no contact with reality, if you weren't already coping and getting on, then how did you get here? And existentialism that I encountered as an undergraduate immediately said the questions, not these philosopher puzzle questions like how do you know there's a world out there and you're not just a mind in a vat, but the questions that bothered you as a teenager, like is there any meaning in the world? Have you lost contact with any kind of source of spirituality or with a sense of something bigger than yourself? Like those are the immediate questions that face philosophy today. And we can give you ways of approaching that phenomenology, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are ways to approach that problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wrote down a quote from the end of your book that bears upon this that you'd also mentioned in that talk at Loyola. So let me read the quote. You write, "The problem of being human is not chiefly one of meaninglessness, but of the inescapability and even tangled overabundance of meaning." And I like this because part of what I hear you saying is that the hard thing to explain is not how do we get meaning out of this like void and chaotic, meaningless world. The problem is explaining how did we get to a point where nihilism became the default. In other words, that nihilistic prior
Hmm.
itself has a history that
Hmm.
we were born into, but should not be self-evident. It should not seem self-evident to us that the world is meaningless, but that seems to be kind of like the default position in late modern uh, liberal societies. So, yeah, how do you think that happened?
Oh, it's a very complicated and fascinating story. And I mean, I think other people have told it better than I could possibly tell it. I mean, there's a Heideggerian version of it. I think the best version we have right now is probably Charles Taylor and Sources of the Self. But roughly, and by the way, I mean, I like that you picked up on that because in a way that's me arguing with myself. Because I think that as a teenager, going back to how I got interested in philosophy, um, I thought my problem of meaning was that, this sort of subjective view that I'm a mind and I'm buffered from the world out there, and then meanings are just dependent on my mind. And so they're completely arbitrary and relativistic, and I just project them outward onto a world out there. And so it looks like the default position, as you say, is one of sort of nihilism. And so the idea that instead our problem is an overabundance of meaning and that we can't get rid of meaning is sort of me arguing with my younger self, my
Mm.
more atheistic, more Nietzschean self. And so part of how I think we got there is because we bought into a story, right, that itself is a set of meanings about the kind of agents that we are. And part of how we do that is we sort of assume a position that we can't assume. I love Taylor's language for it. He calls it the punctual self, almost like think of a period in grammar that's getting smaller and smaller and is almost nothing. But in analytic philosophy, this is called the view from nowhere. So
Yeah.
part of how we get to the problem of nihilism is we assume that we're in the position of the stars, or we assume the furthest position from ourselves. We assume a position that's not a minded position or an embodied position or position of an agent. And then we assume that that is the objective position. This is sometimes called the view from nowhere because this kind of disengagement or bracketing phenomenologically is what allows for the massive advance in the natural sciences. But then, what swings around on the other side here, which is a huge obsession in my work, is if you do that in the human sciences, if you do that in political philosophy, et cetera, it's mission impossible. You actually eliminate the object of study. And so what you actually end up doing is sort of um, bewitching yourself into thinking you've assumed a position from nowhere, when in fact what you have created is a kind of self, a disengaged, neo-stoical, instrumental self that is not very articulate about its own moral sources. And this is where any listeners who are interested in what I'm saying or confused by it even, I can do no better than point you to Charles Taylor's Source of the Self, which tells this whole um, story about how this self came to be. But I think the upshot for the sake of this discussion would be you can't get rid of meanings as an agent. You can't assume the view from nowhere. The weird thing about the universe, if you like, about the cosmos is there is an intelligent, wakeful, meaning laden agent in it, us. And you can't get outside of that. If you try to get outside of that, you just recreate a moral, ethical, meaning position
Mm-hmm.
that is inarticulate about that, the so-called view from nowhere. It's not neutral. It's not the position of the stars. It's another kind of self in history that is disengaged, tries to instrumentally control things, and so forth.
Yeah,
So there's the rub is I think our problem is too much meaning. I mean, even something, if I can say one last thing there, a
sure.
huge event, I think, in our generation was mass shootings had occurred before, but the Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold shooting at Columbine High School, those guys, whatever else you say about them, and I found what they did such a betrayal of our generation, so painful, so repugnant. But they recreated meanings, you know. I mean, I know it's often narrated as a nihilistic thing, but they dressed up in like black. There was a certain iconography of it. There was a certain proto-paramilitarized politics to it. It had something to do with being a disaffected male and reclaiming a certain kind of power. So
Yeah,
even
it's
in the
in
case,
Pearl Jam's Jeremy
yes,
as
yeah.
well. It's a similar kind of um, narrative.
And
Yeah,
that was there even a few years before, if I don't have the chronology wrong, right? I mean, that song came out
that's
at
right.
least 3, 4 years beforehand.
That's right.
And so my point simply being that if you take the interpretive turn, if you take the position of this kind of more humanistic philosophy, nihilism looks really different than just the default. It looks like a position that emerged and that can't disentangle itself from different rival articulations of meaning. It might be the sort of disengaged, neo-stoical kind of technocrat, or it might be the Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold sort of um, paramilitarized, black fatigues, but
Yeah.
lone wolf type thing. But where you write a manifesto, for God's sake, I mean, what a desperate statement of meaning that is. I mean, why write a manifesto, you know?
Hmm.
Um, but the point being that nihilism, far from being the default I came to see, is a set of spiritual moral options that tends to be rather inarticulate about its own sources and have certain dysfunctions and self-defeating aspects to it.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it reminded me of a quote from C.S. Lewis. It's from Mere Christianity. He says, if the universe had no meaning, I would never be able to discover that the universe had no meaning
Yeah.
because the meaning question would never arise.
Right. Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Exactly.
similarly with Taylor, I think he gives a good answer to the sort of postmodern pox on master narratives is there's no such thing as not having one. Even one that denies any master narratives, you're still telling a story about human beings' misguided attempt to provide a be all end all explanation for the direction of history or the purpose of life, etc. Um, so it's not about whether we have a big story. It's about whether or not whether or not we have a good big story. And
Well put.
that's something I
Agree.
want to come back to a little bit because one thing I notice you try to offer is some ways for how can we judge which stories, which forms of meaning making in terms of ideology make more sense, and
Hmm.
sort of what are some criteria we can identify. And I think it's another helpful part of your book is trying to give people resources to think through, okay, yeah, like all these different ideologies are stories, but that doesn't mean it's just sort of anything goes and sort of choose your own adventure.
Right.
Like as as John Goodman's character puts it in The Big Lebowski, this isn't Nam. There are rules.
Yeah.
So On that point, let's turn to the book. So I want to start with the metaphor you use from Borges. So could you tell us about that metaphor and why you used it as a sort of vehicle for your thesis?
Yeah, Borges has this very famous, I'm sure some of your listeners will recognize it, very short story about a fictional empire that becomes absolutely obsessed with map making and cartography. And they're so obsessed with it that they eventually try to make a map that is the exact same size as the empire and that they can unroll over the empire point by point. And then, of course, in typical and to a Borges story, so they suddenly realize, well, later generation realizes this was a completely lunatic project. What are we doing? That is my central metaphor for ideologies, that when we become lost in ideology, when we mistake what I call cartography for geography. So we mistake the fact, to put it a little more concretely, that we think that our ideologies are somehow natural or spontaneous out in the world and that they're not cultural traditions, that they don't emerge within language, history, and we assume that there may be a state of nature or a science or common sense. And to me, that's the mistake that Borges helps us see, where in a way your cultural map is arriving before you and you're kind of unrolling it in front of you. And I think one of the reasons Americans are so lost in ideology and so perplexed right now is we all do this across the spectrum to each other right now. We arrive with our ideological language and map that orients us, helps us understand our political goals. It helps us form a community politically and has positive features to it, by the way. But we arrive with that and we expect other people to speak our ideological language back to us. But this to me would be the same mistake of being an English speaker arriving in Beijing and just speaking English at people and expecting them to spontaneously speak English back. If I did that, I think practically every person on the planet would recognize that there was something slightly insane about that. But I actually think we do that with ideology, and it's slippery. The reason we do that is in part because our ideologies, although they're different political languages, are articulated often within the same natural language. So we'll share English, we'll share a society even in some ways that's contested, but we'll show up and say freedom. And one thing I try to show in the book is, okay, freedom is not a self-standing term. It's interpreted, it's meaning laden, and conservatives, libertarians, neoliberals, social liberals, socialists, democratic socialists, feminists, all freedom is a huge term for all these groups, but they don't mean the same thing about it. Just like when Luther says something about the total depravity of man, he doesn't mean the same thing that Erasmus says when he's arguing for free will. And so we really have the same situation as in religion, where people are using the word God or, soul, but they mean very different things by it. There might be overlap or a play of resemblances. So I think that the reason Borges is so important to the book is because he gives helped me with a metaphor for understanding that while ideologies have a positive function, an orienting function, they can weirdly reverse on us and become the very source of our disorientation because we can't really see the culture past our own nose. We can't see the person in front of us and the way they're speaking or understanding or orienting themselves.
Yeah, we confuse the map with the territory.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes. Mhm.
yeah. So I'll ask you the simple question that you begin the book with. What is ideology?
I have a lover's quarrel with the very famous definition of ideology by Clifford Geertz, the American anthropologist, that ideologies are maps, cultural maps that help orient us within political space. Um, and my lover's quarrel with Geertz is I wanted to improve or expand upon it. And so I think one thing Geertz missed is that these maps have world-making features, that they make the world, and he also missed the critical aspects of it, that any map that says it's mere nature or territory, like you said, we can objectively know it's false. And let me repeat that because a lot of people read the book and, Blakely's a relativist. No, not at all. But we need kinds of objectivity that are appropriate to the object of study. And ideologies are cultural traditions. So how do we become objective about cultural traditions? Well, one way is a cultural tradition that cannot narrate itself as a cultural tradition is objectively false on those terms. It just says we're common sense, we're science, we're encoded into nature. Everyone's naturally a liberal or naturally a conservative or naturally will become a socialist at a future point in time. Those are manifestly false forms of that. So ideologies are maps. They help orient us. They're world making. They create society. They create milieus. They create practices, institutions. They're non-optional in the modern age because in modern society is an artifact of ideology. So you can say, I don't have an ideology, but you're participating in rituals and practices of ideology when you go to the bank, when you go to the restaurant, when you drive down the street, and so on. So they're world-making maps, and they're not just false consciousness. That's a big polemic in the book, the dominant use of ideology on the street level. And due to the influence of Marxism, is that ideology is false beliefs, distorted beliefs. I don't think that's true. With Clifford
Mm.
Geertz, that there's a positive
So
cognitive function. Yeah.
yeah, so you would say that that was going to be my next question is how did ideology come to carry a negative connotation? So would you say that the Marxist perspective that it's just a sort of illusion obscuring reality
Yeah,
is
it's
the
kind of
origin
funny.
of that?
Yeah, it's funny because Marx is the first one, is my understanding genealogically. If you go in history and say who was the first one to use ideology as meaning false consciousness or distorted beliefs, the first one was Marx. And he has a very fascinating theory of it that's worth engaging with, but it's a reduction of all other political systems of belief to distorted, justifying beliefs of the ruling class and of class domination. And then, of course, Marx famously thinks of his own politics as just science, as post ideology. Your post ideological ideology is over. And that is not a credible view on my opinion. But the notion that ideology is false consciousness, curiously, even though it starts with Marx, is now taken up universally. Like if you ask someone on Fox News, what's ideology, they will give you the Marxist definition. I almost want to say, is this cultural Marxism going on? But I mean, the point being just ideology became synonymous with false or distorted belief. And
Yeah.
I don't think that that's a helpful deployment of the term. I think we all have ideology. It has a cognitively positive function. It orients us towards some vision of the good. My term for this in the book is it's ethically magnetic or gives us some
Yeah.
vision of a good society. We need that. We need a vision of a good society. Our problem is we don't agree on what a vision of a good society is. But humans can't do without a vision of good society. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, in my view. This is a neo-Aristotelian view I have, that basically we're the zoon politikon. You need some view of what a good society is. And even if you think you don't have it, you'll just sort of thoughtlessly go with the drift of a view of what a good society is. So
Hmm.
um, ideologies have this positive cognitive function. It's not about getting rid of ideology. It's about becoming more articulate and aware of what it means to be a human being in the modern age and hold ideologies, and the way that they're englobing or can sort of eclipse or cover over what's going on with rival cultures or traditions and why they believe what they believe and so on.
Yeah. One of the things that was so refreshing from the book was it helped me make sense of an exasperating uh, feature of political discourse today, which you began to name there. The way that ideology gets used, on say Fox News or by Jordan Peterson, when he
Mhm.
talks about all those leftist, communist, cultural Marxist ideologues, or Ben Shapiro, or that's the irony is that it's so common on the political right now to use ideology to describe the left when that whole idea of ideology critique of false consciousness came from the left,
Yeah.
came from
Yeah.
Marx.
Hmm.
And we'll come to Patrick Deneen's
Yes. Yeah.
post-liberal arguments
Hmm.
later. But and I noticed that you made the same point in your review of his book. Is it's an oddly Marxist position
Hmm.
because it's regarding liberalism itself as some kind of like complete delusion that anybody who embraces some form of liberalism is living under some kind of spell and is completely confused about what is good for them and what is good for society. So that whole notion of, and I think Matt McManus has called this a kind of postmodern conservatism
Hmm.
lately, this bizarre phenomenon, which is a great example of something you talk about in the text about how ideologies are liquid, of how they can mutate and sort of rub off on one another. So that's definitely something we can dive into later.
Yeah, yeah. Should I
But
say something about that now, or
oh, sure,
'cause
sure,
I have a thought. Yeah, and I thought what you said was really interesting and helpful. So yeah, Deneen is one of these cases where, um, in a way, you have a certain amount of hybridization going on, right? Because part of what's so confusing right now about the new right is what exactly is it? And I think even people within those cultural traditions on the new right, say post 2016, just to put a shorthand on it, the emergence of Trump,
sure.
though it's not reducible to that, but what has happened to fusionist, neoconservative politics in the United States in the last, 10, 15 years? And part of what's gone on is hybridization. And the new right, in part, adopted some of the criticisms of liberal capitalism from social democrats and from the socialist left, as you're pointing out. At the same time, they've hybridized them with claims to say maybe ultranationalism or reaction, so that they're kind of looking backward towards some idealized past. So it's not to say that, oh, the new right is somehow on the left. No, not at all. But ideologies are liquid in this way, and part of the reason we're so lost is since we don't have a good awareness or articulacy that ideology is a cultural tradition. It always surprises us when these cultural traditions either mutate or innovate or hybridize with one that they're not supposed to hybridize with, right? If I said to a listener, do you know that hip hop can hybridize with heavy metal? Oh, yes, of course, I've heard Rage Against the Machine or whatever it is. But if I say to you, hey, conservatism can take on board some of the idea critiques of liberalism that emerged out of, Marxism and its critique of social atomism, then it's their minds sort of explode. But the problem is that we don't have a good orientation over what ideology itself is, right? So
Yeah.
I completely agree with what you're saying there. And in fact, I even think you can find, I mean, I'd be pressed on the footnotes sort of a thing, but I think you can find various places where Deneen speaks openly and positively about Marx, and about some of Marx's points now. Yeah.
He does conceded that in some of I heard him concede that in some of the interviews about the book, like with Andrew Sullivan. Um, so and yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon as well. It's this sort of populist pincer where you
Hmm.
see progressives and post liberals or right wing populists who are voicing similar critiques of neoliberalism. Um, so which I think in part is to the good, but that's another
Right.
matter we can come back to. But this, I love this analogy you're using with music hybridizations because it connects with what I think is one of the most important features of your account of ideology is as as you pointed, it's traditions of meaning or forms of culture. And you got me thinking about Andrew Breitbart's now famous adage, politics is downstream from culture.
Mm.
And what I took away from your book is that this is only ostensibly a book about politics. It's really a book about culture or about the cultural substructure of politics.
Yeah, that's
So,
right.
so I thought maybe you could say more about this. You're right. We have forgotten that politics is cultural, and you emphasize a number of times throughout the book how essential a cultural approach is to picking out what's actually happening with ideological conflict in a way that sort of the default way of thinking about politics and political science and the social sciences can't see.
Hmm.
So, can you tell us some more about why this sort of philosophy of culture is so important for making sense of what's happening politically?
Yeah, well, so I'm a political theorist, political philosopher by training, but I'm in a political science department. And the dominant way to study politics in our society that is present in political science departments, but also popularly in the newspapers, and is to treat um, political beliefs and allegiances as kind of demographic objects that you can correlate or almost like variables. So, when we neglect culture, there can be a tendency to treat political beliefs almost like objects that are sort of hard, to use a metaphor, hence my counter metaphor of ideologies are liquid and cultural, because there's a tendency in the mainstream approach to say maybe do a mass survey, which might, by the way, have a certain amount of value to it. I'm not against surveys entirely, so listeners shouldn't think that. But the problem is that when the surveys actually eclipse the phenomenon out there of politics as culture. So, you might treat ideology as just a variable, like, okay, this person's a Republican or this person's a Democrat, or they believe in this particular issue when it comes to abortion, or this particular issue when it comes to healthcare. And that tendency to atomize and harden the belief as just an object out there um, is a very limited value politically. And you can go for an entire generation where it seems like that more or less works, which is the generation you and I grew up in, because political beliefs were stabilized. But we're living through a time of great upheaval, innovation, change, for better and for worse in our polity, maybe mostly for worse at the moment, but not wholly for worse. And that's why also you have a lot of frustration around polling, surveys, because that effort to treat ideology as just something, a hard fact about you, is really being confounded. And there's so many examples of this. But for instance, the expectation that I'll pick on progressives here now, that that women, white credentialed women, are always liberal, or that of course black people should be Democrats. That assumption, right, doesn't have a kind of cultural sensitivity to the traditions people are living. And so hence the scandal, almost the inability to take in something like polls finding that, oh my goodness, there's a drift going on here, and a certain number of the black vote is now tilting toward Trump. How could this be? I mean, he's got, I
Yeah.
mean, it is a puzzle. I mean, he flirts with white nationalism and all this stuff. So I'm not saying there's not a puzzle there. I'm just saying that when your approach to ideology is that it's a science and that you've got these kind of hard demographic facts that can move around, you stop listening to the underlying culture and stories. You stop seeing how the little variables that you're looking at can recodify their meanings, congeal in new ways, form new constellations and alliances. And so you really lose a grip on reality. And I have to say that
Yeah.
I think part of what's going on with the so-called liberal elites, everyone is bashing right now, is that there is a disconnect. Our
Yeah.
epistemology in big cities and universities is not having a whole lot of contact or grip on what's going on. And people feel like they're flying blind because they are flying blind. They really don't get the black Trump voter, or the
Yeah.
one who should just naturally ideologically, this is lost in ideology, but be part of our cartography and not their cartography, right?
Yeah. Well, you're reminding me of an example of this I came across recently, which is the the evidence coming in suggesting why many Hispanic voters are turning Trump. And the reason is, one of the reasons seems to be that they are more angry about what they perceive to be an attack on religious liberty,
Hmm.
because many of them are Christians
Right,
and then have a traditionalist mindset, than
right.
they are about any kind of racial bigotry.
Hmm.
And the sort of default epistemology of the pollsters and political scientists and sort of, the liberal elite, as it were, really has trouble seeing that because they
Yep.
don't understand culture.
Right.
Um, and they don't understand. I mean, it's sort of the what's the matter with Kansas.
Exactly.
It's a blind spot in the what's the matter with Kansas framework. It can't see that people have different kinds of interests that are a
Hmm.
function of the cultural traditions that they inherited and where they sort of hang out phenomenologically, if you like. So,
Yeah, and
yeah,
if I can say, it makes us very ineffectual at political contest and debate, because again, to pick on progressives, there's this sort of one way progressives become lost in ideology is that they assume that their map of politics, whatever its pluses and minuses, which is a different discussion, when they get lost in ideology and mistake the map for the terrain, they assume that everyone eventually, in a linear historical way, becomes a progressive, and especially groups of the disadvantaged or the peripheral and so on, like you're saying, Hispanics, women, et cetera, eventually are just a natural part of the coalition. And so there's a kind of predictive assumption there that people are naturally or spontaneous, certain objective demographic identities are naturally or spontaneously progressive. And if you recover the cultural view of politics, you just know that cannot be the case, because that's not how politics works. That's not how human agency works. Human agency is self-interpretive. It exists against a horizon of meaning. People can creatively innovate or adopt their beliefs. And so if you want to defend progressive politics, you're still within your rights to do that. It's a viable, credible politics amongst others on the scene today. But a bad way to do it, an objectively bad way to do it, is just to assume, right? And so then what you get publicly is this kind of almost moralizing or exasperated sort of hand-wringing at why do these people not just join the coalition? Like why are Hispanics leaking out? They must be either completely irrational or the arrow of history hasn't had enough time to sort of just
Yeah,
push
or
them
they're
down the
bewitched
conveyor.
by false consciousness. We
Exactly.
understand them better than they understand themselves.
Hmm. Well
Yeah,
put. Exactly.
etc.
Instead
Yeah.
of what I'd rather people do when they have ideological debate is a little bit like when, say, you're going to run into apologetics in religion. Like if a Shia and Sunni Islam are arguing with each other, or intra-religious, like a Christian and a Muslim, or you don't just assume that the person is spontaneously going to be your religion. So then you openly try to argue for your vision of the good. And I would prefer that progressives, conservatives, nationalists, etc. I don't think it's productive at all to just sort of stand inside your map and shout. This is basically how we debate ideology today is all of us come to the very edge of our map and scream at how insane the other one is. You know what I mean? As opposed to an imaginative effort to go inside the map or an imaginative effort to bring people inside our map. We just expect this spontaneous submission to what's naturally and obviously righteous, true, and good about our ideology. And so
Hmm.
I think it should be treated a little bit more the way that debate happens between, religious people when they're arguing over trying to convert people or this kind of thing. It's ideology is a kind of conversion you can undergo.
Hmm. Yeah. And that need not be some sort of wholly irrational phenomenon. It might not be provable, as you point out, through empirical findings and logical analysis, logical argumentation. It needs those, but it's more than those.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, there's so many different directions we could go in. I did want to touch on the notion of ethical magnetism that you identified as a feature of ideologies. And that this was quite striking to me because you consistently do this throughout the book. And even when discussing fascism, which I was like, that's a that's a high bar of intellectual uh, integrity or consistency to like give fascism the benefit of the doubt. But I think it is really important, and especially as we'll get to later when thinking about Trump and Trump voters, um, because it reminds me of a quote from David Frum wrote a book called Trumpocracy a few years ago.
Hmm.
I quite admire David Frum. I think he's been one of the best of the sort of never Trumpers trying to make sense of everything. But he says you can't dismiss these people. Like these are your countrymen and women. You owe them respect. And what I like about your approach here is you're kind of saying, at least what I'm hearing, is that every ideology has a piece of the truth, morally speaking. Like it would not have emerged, and to almost use evolutionary language, it would not have survived. There's almost a notion of like cultural selection. There must be some notion of congruence with human nature, with the world, and more specifically with the economic and technological and ecological conditions of the time, such that certain ideologies emerge in the first place and then get stabilized into traditions.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if that is an accurate reading of
Yeah.
what you were trying to do.
Yeah, and it's very well put actually. And I think that so before plunging into making fascism sense-making and ethically magnetic features seem a little bit more comprehensible, I should tell listeners I'm definitely anti-fascist. And I think it's but to your point, I mean, um, so people are drawn into ideological traditions because they resonate or help them make sense of something that is happening. And like you were saying, and I try to imagine a, counterfactual situation in which an ideology absolutely resonates with nothing. It's just absolutely either inane or flat or stupid, and it has no resonance, right? And I think the major ideological traditions have a certain amount of resonance. I'll say aside here as a personal note that for a long time, one of the maiden name of my beloved grandmother, who came from the Midwest, was Pound, and for a long time, family lore was you guys, were related to Ezra Pound. He's like a cousin, and of course, Ezra Pound is this infamous case of this incredibly brilliant poet with an incredible mind and sight, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, picking out talent, who goes fascist. I mean, just goes like openly, shamelessly, disgustingly fascist. So, is intelligence, let alone Heidegger, who I keep bringing up, so
Yeah.
it can't be a problem of intelligence, it can't be so what is it in fascism that, draws people? A sense that there's an emergency, a sense of collapse, a sense of gathering up community in amidst atomization, I say this because if you're going to enter into debate, say you were Ezra Pound's friend and you admired so much about him, but you just were completely aghast at his politics, just standing there and saying in this house we believe in science, or the socialist revolution will be here in 10 years, or can't you see conservative gradualism is so much more virtuous, that's not going to cut it. You're going to have to get into what's ethically magnetic and sense making in that vision and interpret through it. Okay, so
Hmm.
what is it in that is drawing you and your identity? What is in the sense of crisis that, and can I offer you a better story about that sense of crisis? Not a position in which we say there's no crisis, there's no sense of loss, there's no sense of atomization, but as, can I offer you a better story about a better account of the phenomenon that is resonating with you right now,
Hmm.
or even a sense of like, racial scapegoating, anti-Semitism, all this really repugnant stuff. Okay, why the search for a feeling of we've been sold out, we've been betrayed? There might be something in the resonance of I've been betrayed that is being dysfunctionally, pathologically, violently placed on some people. But the sense of betrayal might not be totally off the mark, right? So just don't think that you're going to get very far with people unless what you're going to do is just take up the position that it is now a time for arms and war, which is a different discussion, justified warfare, all that. If you're still in common society with people, I'm very sympathetic to what you said about, then it is on you to look at the people around you that belong to you, your friends, your neighbors, and enter again into dialogue with them, and try to
Hmm.
understand and comprehend what is moving them, what's making them tick.
Yeah. Yeah. You draw in your account too on this a view of human nature as storytelling animals. Um, and I know you're drawing on Alistair McIntyre in part here, but I see this popping up in a lot of places in the culture too. So there's this social scientist John Gottschall. He wrote a book bestseller a few years ago, The Storytelling Animal. Um, uh, you've all know Harari,
Mhm.
the Israeli historian. He embraces something like this sort of fictionism, right? Is whether it's law, religion, politics, morality, even economics. These are all sort of fictions that we create, we project, and they serve certain evolutionary purposes and so on. Um, and I gather your account is quite different from his,
Yeah,
but his account's becoming very popular.
it is. Yeah.
Um, uh, so when we make that turn towards being, storytelling animals,
Mhm.
how do we avoid a problem that's come up before, which is, well, storytelling makes it sound like it's just made up,
Right.
like it's just fiction, and then we're caught in this sort of relativistic position. Well, my story is just my story, and your story is just your story. So what's misguided? I guess I just want to say what's misguided in Harari's version of that storytelling view of human nature, and how can we get a surer ground than what he's providing?
Yeah, I mean, partly what's wrong with it is the sort of reductive Darwinistic theory underlying it, and he overly subjectivizes story. which kind of gets back to your issue of, well, what would be a different way of doing it that, say, Alistair McIntyre or Charles Taylor, like, why are stories um, not necessarily reducible to the category of fiction? Real stories, if you like, true stories, non-fictional, lived incarnational stories. Um, and I think what's really important to see here, a few things. First is that culture, narratives, stories are not reducible to a single person's mind. So this is sometimes called the background or the social imaginary. Take something like currency. That's a very intuitive one, I think, for people. Money. We can all see that in a certain sense, there's, to use the word again, fiction, which I don't think is entirely helpful here, but there's a certain social fiction of these little bits of paper, these little bits of coinage count for mean currency. But the idea that I could subjectively just opt out, or that it's just a fiction that there's a currency, there's obviously something wrong with that. It's objectively the case that there's a currency. It has a certain value in a certain cultural context at a certain time. It has a certain function. And even though the kind of objectivity we have about it is different than the one we have about, say, heliocentrism or something like that, it's something that doesn't just go away. It's something that is true about our social world. And
Yeah.
so, our stories are like that. There are aspects of them that we cannot just wish away, that we can't just get rid of. And so we don't have autonomy over our stories. If I say storytelling, people might think of, well, some great genius, like I mentioned earlier, like Shakespeare. Well, he just makes up the story, puts false stuff in there, he takes false stuff out. And so he seems to have total autonomy over the story. So maybe it's important to see there's a disanalogy between the kind of creative autonomy we have over a story we just tell, though that can be exaggerated too, because that's in the English language against the background of London, against the background of a bunch of stuff Shakespeare doesn't pick, the theater, Seneca, et cetera, et cetera. But there might be a disanalogy here where the story I live is not a story I just choose. And McIntyre is very big on this. Like, I'm already born mid-story, and everyone who's listening is as well. Like, there's a story culturally, linguistically, who my parents are, what my community is, that is not a story that I can try to push back on parts of that story. I can reinterpret parts, I can innovate on parts, I can run away, I can convert. But there are parts of the story that are sort of mid-sentence that I already find myself against the backdrop of. Now, at the end of A Lost in Ideology, I have all sorts of tactics for how do we objectively parse through storytelling disciplines. Because I do think people ping pong, they're dance partners. They don't look like it, but they ping pong between the view from nowhere. The only way to be objective is data and to disengage from everything, and a radical subjectivism. It's all just my will to power. I just choose autonomously. They don't look like they fit, but they're actually products of the same culture, the radical subjectivism and the radical objectivism. And
Yeah.
what we miss in between, what I always want to ask people, because my students always have this question as well, it's a reasonable question, but honestly, let's start with a story that we all know. Do we really think there aren't better and worse renditions of it? So if we're going to read Hamlet and there's the kind of contestability that's reasonable. Like, is Hamlet really crazy by the end? Reasonable people can disagree on that. But there are parts about the story that are objectively not a good interpretation of the story, right? And so those bad versions of the story that are obviously bad versions where you almost want to say, did you do the reading or did you not pay attention to this, right? That's important in ideology too. That's important in life too. If I can say one more thing here, Taylor
Yeah.
says it's very important to see that objectivity in the storytelling disciplines is a form of practical and not theoretical reasoning. Why does he say
Yeah.
that? Because it's about, in practical reasoning, if I tell you what's the best way up this mountain or to get a vantage point across to that other peak, we're going to have to shift around in space, and you might make a mad scramble over the rocks, or I might make a mad scramble over the rocks and they might slip. And so, we have to sort of change vantage points in the storytelling disciplines. Part of how we argue is, does my interpretation, if you move over epistemically to my position, can you see more? Can you see better than from your position? We would all accept that, in practical disciplines like maybe sport or, mountain climbing I was just using, that you're not, the way you're going to argue about it is through practice and through moving around. That's what storytelling is like, because whose story can make the most sense out of things? That's not the same as relativism. It's true that it doesn't give us the escape hatch from the hermeneutic circle. It doesn't give us a way out of interpretive contestability. I think that's what really bothers people is because the natural science revolution happened, what people want is something they can't have, which is just the data shows you should be a conservative or a liberal. Facts don't care
Just
about
give
your
me the
feelings.
answer. Yeah.
Exactly. And we can't
Yeah.
have that. And when they don't get that, they fall back on subjectivism. And what they miss is this whole in-between terrain that requires a certain amount of humility as a human being. But that in-between terrain is neither radical subjectivism nor the objectivity of verification or just a syllogism. It's this in-between area that we actually live existentially, where you have better and worse answers, but you have a certain inconclusiveness to human life and a certain contestability to the answers ethically, politically to human life. But I mean, damn, are people really expecting some syllogism to resolve for me what the good society is or some little bit of data? That's not a reasonable expectation, you know? That's not a
Hmm.
reasonable expectation. And that is how people who start out in the view from nowhere end up in what you could call the Nietzschean position, whether it's fair to Nietzsche or not, but a kind of will to power position where everything's just subjective. That's how they
Yeah.
go together. Is once you can't meet the standard, then you
Yeah.
maybe ping pong over into this other position, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's where danger lies too, because then, you know, science can very easily get weaponized in the service of my own will to power, as it were,
Yes.
or
Hmm.
my, you know, sects or tribes will to power. Um, and I know you've written a lot about the danger of scientism in that regard. You might say that the political dangers of scientism, apart from the intellectual blunders that can evolve. And yeah, it's something that bothers me a lot too. Is why we have so much trouble in public intellectual life and public life, for that matter, appreciating this in between space that you know you kind of just want to call common sense. I don't want to call it common sense because I know you have a strong critique of that way of thinking, but it is in the realm of practical reasoning, of Aristotelian prudence. And, it's Aristotle nails it right at the beginning of the ethics. It's the mark of an educated person to only demand a level of precision that the subject matter allows.
Right.
And so we shouldn't expect the same, 2 plus 2 equals 4 answers in ethics as we do in mathematics. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as ethical truth,
Hmm.
um, or that there aren't better stories we can tell about what's good at the individual or the collective level. So I appreciated that this point you make about sort of a broader conception of reason. There's a quote that I wrote down here. You write about, quote, a broader conception of reason that includes the interpretive rationality of the storytelling disciplines that is far from relativistic. And yeah, I think we just have a difficult time articulating that form of reasoning, because rationality has been so narrowly defined as instrumental, quantitative analysis, um, and something that yields sort of an objective truth,
Yeah.
that
And I think that,
binding at all times in all
uh-huh.
places and so on.
Right. I think that's another way into the Borges metaphor you asked about earlier is a major way to mistake the map and the territory is, and no ideological tradition is immune to this, is to grab on to the authority and credibility of the natural sciences and sort of say, well, my ideology is a bit like that. It's a bit like just science. And
Yeah,
anyone who denies it is denying something that is undeniable if you're going to remain reasonable.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, gosh, the horrors to which this has been put. I mean, if you think of something like the way Darwinism, or a particular interpretation of Darwinism, flowed into eugenics
Hmm.
in the early
Hmm.
21st century. I mean, and you give so many examples in the book of how this kind of thing happens. So I did want to dive into, particular traditions that you talk about um, in the text. And we can't cover all of them, obviously,
Right.
but liberalism, conservatism and maybe fascism is where where we can end up, and how we can think about whether and to what extent that's emerging now in the U.S. And the liberalism tradition is very interesting because it's getting so much attention of late. We
Hmm.
mentioned Deneen's take on this and post liberalism. A new book was just published called "Liberalism as a Way of Life,"
Hmm.
which
I
is
saw
could
it.
be seen
Yeah.
as a kind of answer
Yeah.
to the post liberal critiques. Um, so yeah, how does your meta map help us think about liberalism in uh, a useful way?
I think that one thing is, well, okay, we can be objective about ideology insofar as we can get rid of those maps as objectively false that claim to be just a science or just nature. And liberalism has certainly been guilty of this. An example I'm sort of hard on is Locke's State of Nature. It opens in the book, and the expectation that the Americas were already a state of nature with proto-capitalist notions of private property, and that can sound like a kind of philosopher's quibble, but listeners, I think, will remember their American history and just how tragic some of the misunderstandings, and I talk about those in the book, were in practice between the arrival of, European colonists and indigenous tribes who really just did not understand what was meant by things like the sale of Manhattan and things. I think they thought they were. Historians tell us that some of the indigenous tribes thought they were maybe allowing for sort of shared use of the hunting grounds, but the way that many of the European arrivals took it was in the Lockean way as well. It's just natural to be a liberal, and you just gave us these beats, and wow, you're such a sucker. Now we've got Manhattan, right? Um, but so one thing we can do is we can eliminate the kinds of liberalism that consider themselves to be mere nature. But I am very critical of the post-liberals who think that liberalism has some kind of an inner logic or mechanics that fade it toward some sort of pathology. You see Vermeil say this, Deneen say this, like it has to become a religion of anarchy or all this stuff. Liberalism is a set of cultural traditions. They're multiple, they're rival. It doesn't have to privatize the good. There are forms of liberalism that make the good public. It is a dilemma internal to liberalism, much like it's a dilemma internal to Christianity, how to, like the problem of evil in front of a good God. Yeah, it's a problem in liberalism. The commons, once you allow for liberal right, that's a problem. But there are different answers to that, some that are more social or communal than others. I quite admire T.H. Green as a liberal because he allows for this kind of communal space within liberalism. But the liberalism in the book, I think one of my main points is there are many liberalisms. Some liberalisms have the pathologies that the post-liberals point to, but many don't. And I seriously have misgivings and doubts about the prediction that the right-wing post-liberals are making, much like I had about Marxists, that liberalism is going to disappear. I don't think liberalism is going to disappear or just collapse under its own weight. It might disappear in the United States. Um, but liberalism is a cultural tradition and I don't ideological tradition, and I expect it to do what it's done already for several centuries, which is to continue to innovate, draw on its sources, resonate with some people or communities more than others, and thereby be mobilized by them. And the reason you're not going to get rid of it is because it has a certain vision of the good that resonates with a lot of people. It's ethically magnetic, a sense of
Mm,
um, you know, personal dignity and a certain amount of agency and
yeah,
a certain sense of being an adult. I love Kant's slogan in What is the Enlightenment about? To be an adult finally, to be treated as adult, not
yeah.
paternalistically, right?
And I imagine it's probably very hard for us to appreciate the ethical magnetism of liberalism because we were born into it.
Yes,
It's
it's true.
it's not something we had to fight through to.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a point Taylor makes in A Secular Age. What is uh, surprising is not how long it took for liberalism to emerge, but that it happened at all.
Hmm.
Um,
Agreed.
because it's so different. Um, but this comes back to the point we mentioned earlier about your idea that ideologies emerge over time and there's something ethically magnetic. To think that liberalism was just some kind of colossal mistake, um, it beggars belief. And it's the kind of thing that could only occur to you if you were growing up within that tradition and were never deprived of it. And what worries me about the post-liberal move is, in much the same way that progressives can be romantic about hunter-gatherer times,
Hmm.
I think that post-liberals, right-wing post-liberals, are romantic about the Middle Ages.
I agree. Yeah.
And there's a big gap there too in terms of social history
Hmm.
and an actual empirical understanding of what life was like for the average person. Um, and the Benedict option is an option because it is happening within a liberal society, which is very different from the Benedictine monasteries and this sort of view of the cohesive integral village that has a kind of ethical magnetism for a lot of
Yeah.
post liberals, understandably.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. And I agree with everything you said. And in a way to pivot to, you said you wanted to talk a little bit about conservatism. One way conservatives can become lost in ideology is they can kind of make a monolith, a nostalgic, sentimentalized monolith out of tradition. But if we see traditions as culturally liquid, we see that always within tradition, there are currents, countercurrents, and so forth. And so, yeah, when you look backward, for instance, as a post-liberal on the medieval age, it can be a temptation to sort of sentimentalize or put a certain glow of unity around, that I don't think stands up to historical scrutiny around Christendom or everyone on board. And, again, to evoke Charles Taylor, like in A Secular Age, there's these fascinating chapters on the medieval world in which he discusses how part of what really created a tension in that world from a religious perspective was a lot of clerical elites were really concerned that medieval peasants in Europe were really not on board with doctrine or the sacraments. They were still basically making a syncretism out of Christianity and different pagan beliefs that came from way
paganism. Yeah,
back. Yeah, paganism. And so part of what's happened through liberalism, through the reform, and so forth is that an emphasis on personalism. Do you really believe? And Taylor points out that this demand on personalism that is taken up not just by the reform, but then by the counter reform and Catholics worried, do Catholics really believe against Protestants and do Protestants really? It feeds into liberalism, but it also has an important thing to say to conservatism as an ideology, which is a lot of you are already post these transformations, these massive transformations, in the sense that what you're hoping for is a kind of intensity of religious belief that never existed in the
yeah.
past and can't exist now. The more people you want all in, the less people are going to be in your community. And if you look back to the medieval church, precisely it included all of society because it was so lax in some ways at the bottom. It allowed peasants to only take the Eucharist right when they died or confess only when they died. Some of them tried out because they were so worried about having kids and offspring. They would actually try out. Taylor talks about this in A Secular Age. They would try out one of their partners just to make sure, okay, this person can have kids. Now I'll marry them. All this stuff that really vexed the priesthood. Like this is not proper. And Taylor's point is a big church is going to have space for people believing in different speeds. And I think a mistake that conservatives make is they assume that, well, first of all, like you were saying, that there was a kind of sentimentalism of unity in the past, but also that if they mobilize that in the present, they're going to have the personalism and intensity belief of the post-reform and of the liberal order where people really choose something together with the unity and monolithic church of the medieval age. But those two don't go together. The bigger you make it, the more speeds people are at, and the more you demand of people real belief, the more you actually open the door paradoxically to I don't believe, or
Huh.
I'm just going along because I'm scared, or So I think
Yeah.
that
Well, that was part of Nietzsche's argument,
mm,
is the will to truth that Christianity cultivated ultimately led to the widespread abandonment of Christianity for a sort of scientistic um, or secular, view of
yeah, and Taylor's
reality.
take on that
Yeah.
is in a way that the reform and the counter-reform, with its emphasis on personalism, which part of what I would say to Deneen or Vermeule is, you guys are converts to Catholicism, number one. So you went on a certain path where your liberal rights are, you're not being true to your own story, but also the intensity with which you believe is very much a modern thing. And
Yeah.
the kind of reproducibility you want across the community is never going to happen because the more personalism of belief you want, the more you're going to have to pass through people's actual agency. Unless you're just going to do a kind of North Korea thing where everyone's Christian because there's like a little, monitor in their house that makes sure they, so there's a real bad fit here. And I think that the problem is that tradition is being mobilized in a way that's not culturally or historically sensitive, which is one way in which conservatives can become lost in ideologies. They can think there's this thing called the West or
Yeah.
Christendom. And conservatives, to give them their due, they're right that politics is all politics is traditional politics. Absolutely right about that. Where they tend to tumble into confusing the map and the territories, they tend to sort of make a kind of monolith out of tradition that's not really there. And they don't see
Yeah.
that once you allow that all politics is traditional, what you have to contend with is rival traditions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I like to hear is I think your take is very even-handed because you're pointing out, all right, here's some things that say Deneen gets and the post-liberals get right. And I think you'd probably also agree with me that he's right that Locke is mostly wrong. Like,
Yes.
like the default philosophical anthropology of
Yeah.
liberalism is wrong.
Hmm.
And ironically, the picture we're getting from evolutionary theory and anthropology shows why it's wrong. We're much more social creatures. And the picture that's emerging from the sciences is actually much more congruent with Aristotle's picture. So they're right. Aristotle gives a generally more accurate view of human nature than Locke.
I'm an
Um,
Aristotelian. We're the Zoon Politikon. That's behind. I don't say it in the book, but it's there.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So like thumbs up to the
Hmm.
post liberals in that
Yes.
respect. But what some things you write in here in the chapter on conservatism, I was just underlining, underlining, underlining. So I just want to zero in on a couple of quotes. You write Burke's revolutionary breakthrough. So Burke, the sort of seminal thinker of the conservative tradition, and I should say conservative traditions.
Hmm.
Um, Burke's revolutionary breakthrough was to consciously theorize and mobilize traditions. Paradoxically, in Burke, we watch tradition become modern. To become a Burkean conservative is already to be modern. Um, I love this because it shows that there's a sort of false economy at work in the frame that conservatives often use is if they have the high ground of tradition and the past and everybody else is doing these weird like modern ideology things and you're saying no, 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 that is them misunderstanding their position. So that just sounds like damn right to me. The other quote is about how we think about conservatism in relation to liberalism. So you write, Burke was right to see that the Enlightenment neglected tradition, but he was wrong to assume it could not stabilize into its own set of traditions dominating society. And this was one of the things that I thought about the most while reading Deneen's latest book, Regime Change,
Hmm.
is that they don't see that liberalism, and I would even say progressivism, are robust, stable, vibrant, and ethically magnetic traditions in
Yeah.
American life. And they are not going away. And a funny thing follows from this, which is that if you want to be a conservative in the Burkean sense today, that means recognizing that traditionalism, liberalism, and progressivism have to be preserved and integrated.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you're tearing the social fabric
Right.
that's going to create the very chaos that conservatives are afraid of.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
If
what
I,
I took from
yeah.
your
No,
your
and
read
thank you
here.
for that.
Yeah,
Can I just add there, because in a weird way, they're in cahoots with a scientistic or sort of technocratic liberalism, which I reject, because scientistic technocratic liberalism also rejects itself as a tradition. So weirdly, when the post-liberals say,
yeah,
well, all of liberalism is a kind of anti-tradition, which is not a defensible view philosophically or sociologically, they get weird support from the hardcore liberals who are like, we're just reason and science, and we're just we're all, kind of data and rationalism. We're not a tradition. But of course, the book you mentioned, which did pique my interest of, liberalism as a way of life. There's a whole tradition in liberalism of being aware of yourself as a tradition. It comes out of British idealism. People like T.H. Green, but also think of people in a different way, like Isaiah Berlin. Charles Taylor's arguably this, definitely some kind of a liberal, but he's a communitarian liberal. In his debate with Rawls, he was always saying, well, our differences are ontological. I reject the anthropology. They're not of advocacy, he says in a famous essay. So there is also a long tradition in liberalism of self-consciously being social, communal, etc. And this is what, in a
Yeah.
way, both sides miss, but they're kind of in cahoots, um, disappearing that aspect of liberalism. And I completely agree with what you said, that the life world in the United States is so marked by liberalism that if you have any kind of avowal to Burkean tradition, you're going to have to contend with that's the kind of selfhood practices, et cetera, that you actually have on hand. And you can't
Hmm.
make a tabula rasa out of this, a kind of Catholic or Habsburgian tabula rasa or whatever the heck they're expecting to do. That's not the kind of thing you have in front of you. That's not the kind of
Yeah.
society, people you have in front of you.
Yeah. Well, it's what you see to go into the low for a moment. Stuff like the rad trad, trad wives like
Yes.
movement. Like there's a very strange way in which now traditionalism, there's a sort of transgressive traditionalism where now it's sort of a hip lifestyle choice for many people, which is like, great. If you want to do that, that's great, but like don't pretend that it's something that it's not. So in some ways, we're all postmodern now.
Yeah.
Um, you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah, the social imaginary that it comes out of is one which is very modern. I'm gonna on Instagram and I'm gonna double down and really express myself, and this authentically resonates with me. And I chose it, and I personalistically went on a journey of conversion, and I realized only the Latin Mass really resonates. There's this whole kind of repressed side to this that is extremely modern. And there's a great deal of imprudence in thinking that you can just thin that out over everyone, the rad trad, over everyone, and that what's going to happen is everyone's going to have that resonant, rich, full experience of rad trad that you are. No, to the contrary, there's going to be ashes in their mouth. They're going to choke. It's going to completely discredit your religion and your traditions.
yeah,
You might win in power. I sort of doubt they're going to win on that one either. I sort of think a prosperity gospel evangelical nationalism has a better, you know, but a chance at basically winning power over the state. But the rad
yeah,
trad thing, I agree with you that it's coming out of, like you were saying earlier, we were all born into a dominant, hegemonic liberal culture, and that had very bad aspects and it had some good aspects. But the people who are going into rad trad, for instance, they still have the birthmarks of that. They still have the sort of fingerprints of that politics on the way they do their new politics.
hmm yeah, in a way that they're unconscious of,
Yeah.
and because they see liberalism as like the great Satan of
Yes.
sorts. Um, so we've started talking more about Deneen. I want to use your review of his book as a sort of segue from conservatism to fascism. So I want to read a little quote from that, and I'll put your review and a link to that in the show notes as well for people who want to check it out. Um, the idea that millions of non-Christian Americans, along with those Christians who find theocracy repugnant, might respond instead with alienation, disaffection, and dissociation from both the government and the Christian religion is never even entertained by Deneen. For a self-described conservative, admirer of Burke, and adamant foe of the French Revolution, Deneen does astonishingly little thinking about the unintended consequences of his radical politics. Instead, he preserves an almost childlike credulity in the belief that, quote, Christianity stands to regain importance whenever and wherever the liberalism falters. Perhaps conservative is not an appropriate name for Deneen's politics at all. There is, after all, a long-standing ideological tradition that claims for itself the exclusive voice of the people and is at once hierarchical and populist, lawful and violent, nostalgically rooted and restlessly hurled into the hazy mists of an imagined future. but evoking its name would deafen the ears of many readers and bring constructive political dialogue to a grinding halt. So, um, let's talk about the F word.
Yeah.
And I want to start by asking you, why do you think it's so hard to talk about fascism today?
I actually was very helped by this really famous historian, Tony Judt, who, said, one of the great historians of the 20th century, who said that part of the reason is because fascism in the 20th century became a kind of moral zero point. It became a kind of measure for human evil, absolute evil, the Holocaust, and, in a way, rightly so. I mean, it's hard to think of a more monstrous moment in modern European history than the Holocaust. However, what the damage that did is that it's created a tendency, you see it in very intelligent, adroit people like Samuel Moyn, to treat fascism as in a way that they don't treat any other ideology, which is as a historical singularity or one-off. That if it doesn't look like Nazism, if it doesn't look like Mussolini, if you don't have the camps, it's not fascism. And so in my own discipline, this is the whole debate over the fascist minimum. Like, what are the ahistorical features that give you fascism? And I think one of the reasons we're so inarticulate about fascism is we're very bad at seeing it as a cultural tradition that can have weak and strong forms, diluted and very, intense forms. And so when it shows up, unless you've got people, I sometimes I think I make this joke in the book, but it'd be a little bit like saying it's not liberalism unless you've got powdered wigs and the Boston Tea Party. I mean, that really is the standard. It's like, unless I see with my eyes a swastika, it's not. And by the way, you can't see swastikas, unfortunately, in American public life right now. But for some people, they don't have, they're lost in ideology. They don't think of ideologies as cultural and liquid. And so they can't see that you could have a politics that takes on board fascist themes, fascist concepts like the concept of a sort of emergency or crisis that you get in Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi jurist, extremely brilliant thinker. But you can't say this man was not a fascist, but he has the whole notion of a state of emergency in which a dictatorial power has to resolve all problems. It's a
Yeah.
rival version of sovereignty to some of the other ideologies instead of like
And
say,
you're
yeah, no,
Yeah,
go ahead.
and the world building feature of ideology, you touch on this with fascism because you point out the diagnosis of emergency is often a call to enact an emergency. And you,
Yes.
you show how an example of this was Michael Anton's Flight
Hmm.
93 election
Yeah.
essay in 2016, which was, for people who haven't read it, was the idea that just as on 9/11, right, they had to rush the cockpit to stop the hijackers, and you might die, but it's worth it because otherwise the plane's going to be crashed into the Pentagon. So I don't want to come out and ask the question, are we on the brink of fascism in America? But I kind of do. I mean,
Hmm.
it's something I've been wrestling with over the last month and reading intensively, um, in terms of what does the new right believe? Uh, what's the history of, you might say, the fascist imaginary in
Hmm.
America, sort of the Minority Report
Yeah.
in American history in the 21st century. Um, and you touch on this a little bit in the book, about some ways in which Trumpism seems to, manifest some aspects of
Hmm.
fascism. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, my view is that basically you have a hybridization of fascism with neoliberalism in the United States in the case of Trump. So it might be helpful for listeners to know that part of what I narrate as the ethically magnetic features of fascism are a state of emergency, the notion of a messianic dictatorial power or person. Often a man, doesn't have to be a man, who resolves the emergency. All this comes out of Carl Schmitt. But then also a notion of ultranationalism and a notion of what differentiates fascism from conservatism. The reason it's not conservative is that it's radical and revolutionary in a way that's familiar in socialism. But unlike socialism, which has a radical revolution toward the future, toward a future society, in fascism, there are both backward and future-looking aspects to it. It's about the restoration of an order. Hitler's Third Reich. Well, there's the First and Second Reich. Mussolini thought he was reestablishing the greatness of Italy back to the Roman Empire and so on. So
Right.
it's important to see that the narrative the story, the map the fascists use has certain recurrent themes, right? Some of these themes you can see resonating with the new right. So the new right, or like Deneen's book, I mean, what makes it no longer a book on conservatism? Well, he says you might have to use violence, you might have to be revolutionary. Whereas the conservative position in Burke is gradualism, you don't change too much, you accept the inherited order because it's time out of mind and no one person can comprehend it. So conservative, you can convert out of any of the maps into fascism, by the way. Like Mussolini's a clear case. He started out as a socialist and he founded the fascist party in Italy. But you can also come out of conservatism into fascism. One way you can go from being a conservative to being a fascist, you can start to think that the emergency is so steep and the given life world is so degraded that you just need a sort of revolutionary act from the top down, right? But likewise, and I think this to Trump is I think that in the United States, you've always had small groups of neo-Nazis. You've had the Ku Klux Klan and whatnot, which was a model for Hitler. There are historical books on this that are quite fascinating. But I think there's another source in neoliberalism and the idea of the boss as having total control that Trump comes
Yeah.
out of that is a very American kind of authoritarianism. So one thing I would say to listeners is when I say that fascism is hybridized in the United States, well, I'm not saying what you should next expect is the entire politics of it to look like the Proud Boys, or I forget these groups that are paramilitarized. That is happening, and it looks more Nazi-like, the torches and all that stuff. What you should expect is an American hybrid that might not be as disciplined, that might still have tax cuts, that might it's it once you it'd be a little bit like going back to our example of can you hybridize country music with hard rock? Yes, you can. So if you go listen to this band, expect to hear some electric guitars, but expect to hear folksy and the use of a banjo or whatever. Expect it. And likewise, what I would say about fashion in America today is expect to see in the new right some fascist themes and elements, and expect to see some elements that are not from fascism. You're dealing with fusionism and hybridization. There's a real question as to how much it intensifies in the fascist direction, how much the
Yeah.
anti-Semites, the Nazis, the paramilitarists get the upper hand, and how much the sort of neoliberals corporate side that maybe isn't quite as on board with that, but is willing to make its peace with it, some parts of it, say like a Peter Thiel,
Oh,
how
you
much that gets
just
different.
yeah. Brainwave. Have you read the biography of Teal?
I have not. Should I? I
You
saw it.
should. You should. And I would just advise to listeners, if
Uh-huh.
there's one book you read this summer, read it. It's called The Contrarian.
Mm.
Um, I really don't know where to begin. I have a question about conspiracy theories that
Mhm.
I will come back to in a minute. So I want to put a pin in that for a minute. One thing I've found frustrating is I think it's getting harder to not be a conspiracy theorist. I can feel the zeitgeist tugging at the edges of my mind, trying to get me to entertain things. And I'm always suspicious whenever
Yeah.
somebody's like, he's the one behind everything, whether it's, Obama or Trump or whatever. But I gotta say, uh, from just an empirical standpoint, if you had to pick one person, Teal is almost behind almost everything. It's stunning, and I'm glad you brought him up because he's a libertarian, um,
Right.
but he also has authoritarian tendencies.
Hmm.
And you touch on this a number of times in the book that there's almost a kind of shadow element to libertarian thinking, where it thinks it's about liberty, but it's kind of in practice often about power. And I think you're exactly right because the position I'm starting to converge on is that in terms of like what's happening now in America is a possible new fusionism between. So we've seen the collapse of the old fusionism
Hmm.
between libertarianism and sort of social conservatism. It was probably held together by the Cold War
Yeah, I
and
agree. Yeah.
the threat of the Soviets.
Hmm.
And now that that's gone, it's one reason things are sort of haywire, in addition to other reasons. But the new fusionism is potentially between libertarianism and Christian nationalism,
Yeah.
both of which I think have now concluded that democracy is an obstacle to their agendas.
Hmm.
Thiel's openly come out and said this, that he
Hmm.
thinks capitalism and democracy are incompatible.
Hmm.
Uh, and have you looked into Project 2025 at all?
No.
The Heritage Found. So it's the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for Trump's second term.
Hmm.
And it's basically Bannon's desired deconstruction of the administrative state, kind of on steroids.
Hmm.
Um, it's starting to get covered in the press now that we're getting closer to the election. But yeah, worth looking into. But
Hmm.
it's uh, it's based on bringing back the federal government to a pre-New Deal
Hmm.
situation. And the Claremont conservatives, which Anton, who you quote in the book, is one of the main proponents, that's their view. They
Hmm.
think that it's so-called classical liberalism. So they think the Constitution, the amendments after the Civil War, and the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, like that was it.
Hmm.
The rest is all a perversion or distortion of the Constitution, and they see it as an oppressive and authoritarian uh, form of progressivism, and it's all got to go. So that appears to be the plan in
Huh.
terms of the second
Interesting.
term.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
fascinating, even if you take some of the other post-liberals we're talking about who seem to want to hybridize with social democratic elements, right? Because you take people like Sohrab Ahmari or, they're instead saying, well, you need an aspect of, but that's fascinating. I actually am very sympathetic to what you're saying, that a new fusionism is forming. And one thing I would exhort on listeners is just one way to become a little less lost in ideology, we're all somewhat bewildered, myself included, is to just be aware of this creative potential for hybridization,
mm,
and the old configurations and constellations have broken up, and even if they were to come back, they wouldn't come back in the same way. And I mean, I think that you're probably right that there's a kind of ultranationalist, Christian nationalist authoritarianism that is aligning itself with a certain new kind of a libertarianism that doesn't see democracy as its basis anymore. Like it's split ways. It's interesting that you say that Thiel has just openly said, I didn't realize that, but that
yeah,
capitalism and democracy should just be peeled apart. Because of course, in the era you and I grew up in, those all went in unison. And then China was a really hard one for people to figure out because it seemed like it started to do capitalism better than the United States, but it didn't
yeah,
have democratic features to it, right? But it's interesting to hear you say that now it's being openly said, well, let's just peel these apart, right? That
yeah.
um,
And Thiel wrote
and
that essay in 2009.
mm,
It was a talk he gave at the Cato Institute.
really, huh.
It's called "The Education of a Libertarian." Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. But yeah, gosh. So my conspiracy theory question, yeah, is why do you think I don't know when the date was, but
mhm.
sometime in the last um 10 years or so, conspiracy theories have sort of moved more into the Overton window of
Mhm.
American political discourse. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts for on both the
Yeah,
left and the right. So I'm wondering if you have
I've been
thoughts for why that's the case.
I've been asked that question before, and last time it was the very first time I it even occurred to me, and I'm still sort of working my way around it. Because one thought I had is, well, it can appear when you're totally lost within your own cultural map, and you mistake it for the territory, so you really don't understand the kind of ethical and cultural language that other people are using. It can appear as though um, their whole way of acting in the world is kind of only you can only make sense out of it out of some sort of nefarious mechanism. So you have to come up with some kind of conspiracy theory about those people because it's not
Yeah.
possible that. So one thought is conspiracy theory is bad hermeneutics. It's what we do when we can't
Mm,
make sense of the other ones. So we look for some way to make sense of them. On the other hand, I agree with you that conspiracy theories have become more credible. And I think there's probably a story to be told there. Hannah Arendt says in The Origins of Totalitarianism that there was a ton of conspiracy theory in Weimar Germany. And she says that it has to do with the atomization of people and the loss of social trust. So,
Yeah.
it's something very deep. It's not exactly pre-ideological, but it's something that cuts across the ideologies that people trust everyone less now. They trust their teachers less, they trust less to leave their
Yeah.
kids at schools, they trust their doctors less, they trust police less, they trust, so communities become very abstract, maybe due to this bad liberalism we've been discussing that we enacted as a form of world making and atomization. We're very hunkered down and split apart. The pandemic probably accelerated it. So I think
Yeah.
that
Scrolling alone,
scrolling
as
alone,
as I
yes,
I just saw came across a recent essay
yeah.
called that. Yeah.
I will say, as a form of a manner of sociology, I tend to think that no one person could McIntyre says this in After Virtue, no one person could possibly be in control of the whole, social situation. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the dream of technocracy or even authoritarianism is, um, I'll say in this way, a fiction in the bad sense of the one decider. One thing I don't find at all persuasive about Carl Schmitt is that one authoritarian decides everything. There's the final decider. And I think sociologically, that's never what happens. That
Hmm.
um, in part because we inhabit these cultural traditions, we're always sort of socially making meaning with other people. And so no one person could be in control. And so there can be real plots, real conspiracies, and so on, and there can be a place for that. But the idea that one person or one cadre is pulling the strings on everything is not really how social reality goes down, in my view.
Yeah. Sort of
So
a fairy tale view of the evil king
yes,
uh trope that
Teal
yeah.
can walk into something that, was kind of prepared for him by millions, So you can have disproportionate influence by single individuals
Yeah.
on my social ontology, but you can't have the person who makes everything happen, if that makes sense. We do it
Yeah.
together. We make social reality together. We participate in it together. We reproduce it together. And so when someone arrives who looks like their moment is almost inescapable, a Napoleon, whoever it is, it's because a lot of works and hands that are anonymous have gone into that moment that that person appears and has a great deal of range suddenly. It seems like their moment has come and that you
Yeah.
can't get rid of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like this notion of the participatory nature of world making.
Mhm,
And it makes even more sense, I think, today now with social media, because we're literally not just consumers, but producers
mhm.
of media. We're doing it right now, right?
Yes.
Um, and I wanted to close with another story from Borges. It just so happened that when I was reading your book, I was also reading a collection of his short stories called Labyrinths.
Hmm.
And do you know the House of Asterion?
I do, but it's
It's
been
the one
so
about
long since
the
I've read it that, yeah.
okay, yeah. Well, it's this. It's like 4 pages, and it's a
Uh,
retelling of the myth of the Minotaur.
right. Yes, yes,
Theseus'
yes.
slaying of the Minotaur. What's cool is he tells it from the perspective of the Minotaur, because in the traditional sort of conventional reading of the myth, the Minotaur is this monstrous sort of dragon-like evil thing that needs to be killed, and Theseus is the hero.
Right.
But this is kind of showing that like the Minotaur is the victim. Like he was born into this mutant body and then locked in this prison and for no fault of his own. And he's lost in this labyrinth and locked in this labyrinth. And when I was reading your book, I was thinking of, in a way, like maybe the whole message is like, we are the Minotaur. Rather than treating our sort of political
Mhm.
enemies as enemies and as if they are evil or stupid or whatnot, and we are free of ideology, right? We're outside the labyrinth.
Uh-huh.
Maybe the place we need to start from is, we all are lost in this labyrinth. We all inherit some ideology, and we're all very, very prone to being blind to our own shadow.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Thank you for that, David. I should have talked
and
to you before I finished the book because this is a wonderful way to have ended you know what? I went on a massive Borges binge in my early 20s. He's a great literary hero of mine, but some of the
yeah,
stuff I've not gone back to. And that is a very fascinating observation about that story. Yeah, like we've met the Minotaur. It's us. We're in the labyrinth. We're the ones that, yeah. Um,
yeah. And
mhm.
yeah, it's the
I'm gonna
problem is
reread
not
it. I
Yeah,
want to
that's
reread it.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super short. Um, well, there are tons more questions I have, but in the interest of time, I think we can draw things to a close. But my last question is, what is next for you?
I'm working on a book on political theology with a friend of mine at USC whose name is David Albertson. That we're trying to come up with a sort of positive vision, which would be one amongst other contenders in a kind of ideological age. But yeah, a political theology that sort of revives um, democratic and solidaristic politics.
Got it. Yeah. Well, best of luck, and
Thank you.
yeah, thanks for coming on and talking. And yeah, for listeners, I would say yeah, first read Jason's book, and then second read the Peter Thiel biography.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah.
so um, yeah, thanks again for your time and for yeah sharing your views.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.